Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I'm coming to you today to share a very special announcement of a booktube event happening in August, Short Story Summer. This event is the brainchild of Brandy, our own literate Texan, and is co-hosted by a really lovely group. Brandy at the Book Eclectic, James at Quaint and Curious Volumes, Crystal at Viber Artsy, Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads, Nicky at My Messy Bookshelf, Brad at the Homeschool Library, and Steve Donahue. In order to participate in the month-long event, all you need to do is read one short story of your choosing. But we'd love to encourage you to dive in a little deeper. How about going whole hog and reading a short story every day? Or how about marking every square on the 30-square bingo card or challenge card filled with a variety of categories? I know several readers are interested in trying exactly that. The categories on the bingo card fall into 6 general groupings, categories based on the time period when stories were written, the particular genre of the stories, from mystery to horror or science fiction or historical fiction, the part of the world the stories emerge from, or the use within stories of particular literary elements like child narrators or twist endings. Of course, you're welcome to play along in whatever way works for you. You might want to fill out the whole board or maybe just complete a row or a column. The board is just to offer you some inspiration. Feel free to choose whatever stories you're interested in reading too, and however many you'd like. I haven't put together my own plan yet, although I know I'm going to try out some stories by authors I really should have read some time ago, but haven't yet, as well as perhaps some stories that I've loved for a really long time. I thought today I'd talk about a few of those longtime loves. Some stories that have been part of me since I was young, that I make allusions to fairly frequently, and that I've taught to students on a few occasions, and that at least at some point I basically had memorized, but I'm afraid that's lapsed recently. And I want to recommend them to you. There is something you might notice about these choices that they have in common, which I suspect you'll see right away. Perhaps my very favorite writer of short stories is Eudora Welty. I'm going to name my 2 favorite stories of hers, which are really quite different from each other. The first is the hysterical Why I Live at the P.O. This is the story of a young woman who has had a squabble with her family, with whom she lives, after her sister moved back home. She moves herself to the tiny little post office she runs in the tiny little community, and she's giving an account of the events that led her to move out to a specific person who appears to be someone she doesn't know who's come into her post office. You will not stop laughing as you read this short little story, and if you're anything like me, you might soon find yourself quoting Welty's wonderfully funny phrases about people standing around eating breast of chicken, or about deliberate calculated falsehoods, or maybe you'll be sticking your fingers in your ears and refusing to listen. This is a story that could knock off several squares on the Short Story Summer bingo board. In addition to meeting the squares for North America and 1900 to 1949, you could also mark off first-person narrator, and maybe also unreliable narrator, depending on how you choose to define the term. The other Welty story I want to mention is her quiet and powerful story, The Worn Path. It is really quite a different style from Why I Live at the P.O. Here we have the story of an elderly black woman in rural Mississippi going on a long walk to acquire medicine for her chronically ill grandson. Along the way, we begin to see how race played out in the South during this era. The main character has a tremendous amount of dignity, which, if anything, contributes to why this story feels of a piece, or at least a reflection of, classic literature, from Homer's Odyssey to the Bible. I've made a few videos on each of these 2 stories, including some serious deep dives that might take you longer to watch than it will take you to read the entire stories, which are both quite short. I'll leave links to them down in the comments in case you're interested. Whenever I talk about Welty, I think of another favorite Southern writer of short stories, Flannery O'Connor. Her stories are astonishing, often violent and funny, and always rooted in her Catholic faith, although they often don't feel like it. I'm going to radically oversimplify her storyline and say the much too basic point that in her work, we often watch major characters go from self-satisfied and sure of themselves to absolutely down on their knees, humbled and transformed. I have several favorites. If you're new to O'Connor, you might want to start with what I think is probably her most read story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find. This starts with a family, parents and children and the grandmother, in the car, setting out for their vacation. Some duplicity on the part of one character accidentally lands them in a complicated situation that does not go the way the family had envisioned their vacation. And while you will be horrified by what happens in the story, you'll also find yourself laughing aloud. I'll leave a link to my longer discussion of the story, but if you haven't already read it, make sure you do that first. And if you're interested in pairing the story with a more contemporary retelling of it, be sure to check out Stephen King's short On Slide End Road. Actually, I think I made a video about that comparison, and if so, I'll link to it as well. Now, if you are a Hannah's Books completist, shall we say, you might be expecting me to talk about O'Connor's Everything That Rises Must Converge, which is definitely a fantastic choice, which I always recommend highly. But today I want to mention a story I don't think I've talked about on booktube before, O'Connor's wonderful Good Country People, a story I love even more than A Good Man Is Hard to Find and Everything That Rises Must Converge, I think. Here we learn the story of an adult woman living at home with her mother, who has changed her name from Joy to Helga, mostly to spite her mother, and express her discontent with the world. Helga thinks of herself as not only an intellectual but a progressive thinker, far more advanced than the naive people who surround her at home. She decides more or less on a lark to seduce the earnest Bible salesman who knocks on their door. But, as it turns out, she's the one who gets taken in. At least to me, it seems clear that Helga is a stand-in for O'Connor herself. I think The Good Country People will be the only story I recommend here in this announcement video that I'll read myself during this event. Maybe I'll do a deep dive into some of my favorite parts, including examples of what I'm going to cryptically call wordplay embedded into action. More on that in an upcoming video. And for the last story I'll talk about today, let me mention William Faulkner's twisted Gothic tale, A Rose for Emily, about how a Southern community in the post-Civil War South deals with the aging woman who becomes hermit in her own house. I chose to discuss this story here because August is not only the month for Short Story Summer, but also the BookTube event Faulkner in August. So, Faulkner is getting a special nod from me today. Actually, if you haven't read Faulkner before, this story is a great place to start. He can be a really difficult writer, combining traditional Southern folk story elements with some very modernist elements too. Sometimes I dream about making one of those grid memes for modernist literature. I'd put early 20th century Southern lit to describe the top squares on the grid, and early 20th century non-Southern lit on the bottom squares. Then for both the top and bottom squares on the left side of the grid, we could use the label lawful, and the squares on the right would be labeled chaotic. Virginia Woolf is one non-Southern modernist author that I would consider lawful, whose innovative writing style takes a little time to get familiar with, but which is fairly dependable once you get her. We might put Eudora Welty in the Southern modernist lawful section. While her writing has clear modernist elements, and while her stories are sometimes very different from each other in tone, they're always fairly steady and fairly easy to understand. On the other side, opposed to the lawful category, is the chaotic side. On the non-Southern part, I would put James Joyce. His experimental style changes from moment to moment and doesn't have that basically approachable and consistent style that Woolf and Welty used. And of course, for the Southern version of the chaotic modernist, we have Faulkner, whose work is deeply Southern and traditional in certain ways. Yes, but also deeply chaotic, making readers work really hard to figure out what on earth he means. That puzzle is, at least for me and a lot of other readers, great fun, but it also certainly makes us live with some discomfort as we try to piece things together. And of course, there are a lot of very sophisticated readers who think that kind of effort is an utter waste of time. Not that it is too hard, but that it is just stupid. A Rose for Emily is actually pretty straightforward for Faulkner, but it still takes a bit of work to make sense of the chronology. And the chronology is what exposes the element of horror in this story. And since horror is one of the genre categories on the bingo card, you could check it off with A Rose for Emily if you're a bit nervous about that category, or with O'Connor's Story or Kings if you're a bit braver. All right, that will do it for today. I can't wait to hear about the stories you already love and the ones you're looking forward to sampling in August. If you already have some ideas, I'd love to hear your thoughts below, including any recommendations you might have down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me here today for this announcement video. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.